Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today in this video I will tell you about faceted curved wooden chair. These are all the pictures of faceted wooden curved chairs. You can see all the pictures carefully. I have been itching to make something new for a while now and wanted to make something that would challenge me a bit more than normal. I had seen some curved chairs that looked pretty cool, so thought I would have a go at something similar. Material wise, I thought that going with trapeziums would be best. I would be able to get much more out of my wood than with the other two options. That's as far as I went with my planning, but had no idea how would attach the seat parts to the ribs, but on to that later. Supplies. Now further below, these are all the supplies which are used in this project. Now step number 1, rib wood. I wanted the width of the ribs to be around 70 mm 3 inches, but my oak was not quite wide enough to get two ribs out of each plank, so I decided to go for a strippy wood by adding the oak with sapple. This enabled me to use the whole oak plank. Now step number 2, cut the rib sections. These are all the cutting section pictures. I had worked out the top and bottom length of my trapeziums based on an 850 mm diameter circle and calculated the angle I needed to cut the rib material. Once that was cut, I stepped a stop to the right hand side of the saw so I could butt up the rib plank to the stop, cut, turn over and cut again. Now step number 3, construct main ribs. These are all the main ribs. I started by cutting full length ribs into both ends of most of the sections, approximately 5 mm 0.2 inches wide on my table saw. By cutting one saw width and then turning the piece around for a second cut, which made sure that my ribs were central on the ribs. For the end pieces, only one side needed to be cut. As a hobbyist woodcutter, I don't have loads of clamps, so this step took days to complete as I could only glue two sections together at a time. Now step number 4, tidy up ribs. You can see all the pictures carefully. With all the 5 ribs complete, I needed to tidy up the splines, so started by trimming them on the bed saw and finished the internal trimming with a chisel. I then sanded all the ribs with a Ramble orbital sander with 80, 120 and 180 grit sandpaper. Now further, step number 5, fix the main ribs together, part 1. See the pictures carefully. To create the curve between the ribs, I decided to use 2 rows of support pieces. I started with the widest parts closest to the front of the chair, eyeing in a good looking distance an angle between the ribs. I cut one section first to check how it was going to look, and once I was happy, I cut the remaining 3 sections. I then cut pocket holes to each part, offsetting the holes to one side so when they were screwed in, the screws didn't fall on each other. Now step number 6, fix ribs together, part 2. I started fixing the ribs together in pairs. First, to make the whole process easier, I started by fixing the large cross piece first, using a square and reference piece to position the wood before screwing it down on the first rib. As space was tight, I needed to use either a screwdriver with right angle head on it, or as space got even tighter, I used a pocket hole driver with a small spanner to tighten the screw. Now further moving towards step number 7, legs. Below, these are all the pictures. See them carefully. The next challenge was to add the legs. These would be attached to the ribs, so would also be angled in 2 directions. I started by clamping some leftover ribs parts in between 2 parts of oak. This would make a natural recess for me to fit the legs on the ribs. I made some dowels on the lathe, cut them to length, followed by gluing and doweling the holes. Once it was all right, I trimmed the dowels and sanded the area to 180. Now, step number 8, seat pieces part 1. Ideally, I wanted the seat pieces to be fixed to the ribs so you could not see any fixing, but I could not think of a way to do it easily. In the end, I used small angle brackets to fix the seat pieces to the ribs, although at some angles you can see them so were not ideal in the end. I started by ripping lengths of the oak with a 10-degree angle to each side, the same angle as individual rib sections. This step had to be repeated for each row as they are different angles and widths all the way up. A small amount of adjustment also needed to be done so all the gaps were uniformish and all sides were parallel to each other. This was a very lengthy process as even a fraction of a millimeter to one side was noticed. Now step number 9, seat pieces part 2. After I had fixed 2 rows, I decided to sand and oil each part before attaching them to the ribs, as taking them all off again and refixing into the exact same place I imagined would take a long time. The further I got up the chair, the smaller the gap became and was more and more difficult to fix the brackets. For the bottom row, I cut a 45-degree cut to the top edge, which I then sanded to a curve to make it more comfortable on the legs. Now, step number 10, paint. Now, further, step number 10, paint from brackets. The only thing I didn't really like was the obviousness of the fixings from the certain viewing directions. To make the front ones less obvious, I added a coat of primer and then painted the brackets a brown color similar to the wood. Now step number 11, finished. These are all the finishing pictures of the project. Once it was all put together, I added another couple of coats of oil on and a final layer of wax. In the end, I think it turned out really good. Now step number 12, update. These are all the updating pictures of the project. So following publishing this Instructable, I still was not happy with the visibility of the brackets, and one of the comments gave me an idea to make a cover for the brackets. It does make the back much better. It does make the back much better, not as good as a method with no visible fixing, but the best I could do with what I had.